In a previous video, we had discussed Porter's five forces and how they came about as a result of Porter's research. Now I want to take you through an exercise about how we would apply this, how they have applicability for your firm or for an industry if you're doing an industry review. As a business manager, you want to know how each of those forces are going to manifest itself against your specific industry. And then as you study it further, how it would apply to your particular firm. Now, of the five forces, two of these can easily be understood prior to entering the marketplace. Those are the power of suppliers and the power of buyers. Suppliers have the ability to set market price under certain conditions. And what suppliers try to do is keep prices as high as they can. And buyers will try and suppliers will try and keep the prices as high as possible, while the buyers will try and force prices lower. The key as to who will be successful is based on the capture of the part of the value chain that's being transacted in this particular part of the sale and purchase process. Now I've got a red star there because I have not explained to you what value chain is. And that's going to come up in our next presentation, but this is quite important in all of the interactions between buyers and sellers. Now, supplier power is really defined by the amount of asymmetry between the supplier and the buyer. If you've got few suppliers of a product and a lot of buyers, the supplier is going to have the strong power. If you got a lot of suppliers and few buyers, then the supplier has weak power. Now, powerful suppliers capture a larger part of the value chain, which again we'll define in our next presentation, by charging higher prices, by limiting quality and services, and by shifting costs to the industry participants, even when the buyer can't pass them on. So, for example, I think one of the things that you will be seeing shortly is that Amazon is going to limit the amount of times that they're going to give free, or the amount of the places where they're going to give free delivery. So they'll be limiting the quality and services if they do that, while at the same time giving good prices, but they have to recognize certain realities. As far as shifting costs to the industry participants, even when the buyer can't pass them on, from about 15 years ago, one of the key things in the cost of personal computers was the fact that cost was shift to the buyers. And that was when Intel became approximately 95% supplier of chips to the personal computer industry. So they really controlled that entire marketplace, and they could set prices. Correspondingly, Microsoft had about the same percentage of software for the mini computer industry. And in both cases, Intel and Microsoft were able to set the price that they would charge the personal computer industry, even though the personal computer industry was not in a position to pass on any price increases from those two suppliers. As a result, the white box personal computers ended up really being Wintel's. Intel inside and Windows is the operating system. And this is because of the supplier power in that particular industry. Now, buyer power is defined by the amount of asymmetry between buyer and supplier. It's just the opposite of supplier power. And this is in industries where there's a few buyers and many suppliers. And there the buyer has the strong power, where there are many buyers and few suppliers, then the buyer has weak power. This is just the opposite of what it was with the supplier power. Buyers with the ability to force prices lower, try to force prices lower. The suppliers try to hold the price line, and the key is to capture the greatest part of the value chain. Again, this is just the flip side of the position that suppliers have when they have the power. Now, what are the sources of buyer power? Well, buyers can try to force the price. There are few customers in the industry. There are low switching costs, and this is another term that I haven't explained to you at this point, but we will get into it a little bit later on. Large order volume per customer. And one thing that you know, the red star tells me I haven't defined that for you, but I'm going to define it right now. Anytime you are buying in large quantities from a supplier, the supplier is going to get reduced costs because they're spreading their overhead over a larger base of business. And therefore, if you buy a large volume with every order, you'll have an opportunity to drive down the costs for the supplier and drive down your cost as a buyer. Finally, if you have an undifferentiated product, price becomes an important buying criteria. And an example of this would be the horsehair matting that's under the floor mats or the carpeting that's inside of your car. Now that is strictly an undifferentiated product that you don't even know exists until you've had that car for about 4 years and your heel has worked its way through the carpeting on the floor down to where that undifferentiated horsehair padding is. So the supplier of that really doesn't have much power. The buyer has all the power because he could switch without any diminution in the quality of his product. Now, other sources of buyer power, the buyer can credibly threaten to integrate upstream. And this is if in the case of if he thinks that the supplier is making too much money. A good example of this, an interesting example of this, 15 to 20 years ago, the tin can industry was a very big deal. This is before and also in conjunction with the introduction of plastic bottles for beverages and other materials that need to be packaged. Campbell Soup Company determined that their total use of tin cans was so significant that they could build a tin can manufacturing facility within their company and save money versus buying the tin can products from other suppliers. And subsequently, they have become the largest single manufacturer of tin cans in the country. Another source of buyer power is where there are many suppliers, because nobody can hold you up too badly. They have to kind of knuckle under because they know that you can always go to another supplier and at any point, just based on the difference of price from that supplier. Another aspect of this is when the customer buys a significant part of the seller's output. And this is ties in with the preceding slide where you have large order volume per order. But in this case, what we're dealing with is the total purchases by the buyer are a significant part of the total's output for that product. Not an individual order that's really large, but they're continual buying a significant part of the supplier's output. Now, there are cases where the buyer must use his bargaining power. This is going to be where the buyer is truly price sensitive. If that purchase represents a very large percentage of the total buyer's cost, he has to buy down his costs because he can make more money buying more cheaply for his raw materials than he can in the manufacturing process using those materials. If the buyer industry has a low profit margin and or low cash flow, and this is typical of mature low growth industries, again, he must try and buy down his prices. Now, in my professional career, one of the things I sold was industrial grades of paper for making of boxes. And I remember one of the first times I called on a customer here in Los Angeles. In our conversation, he said, "You know, I've never made a penny making boxes. I've always made my money by buying my raw materials at below market prices." So this is a case where that happened that way. And I found that the material cost could run for making that box could run as high as 70% for material cost. And the remaining 30% had to be used for the bonding material, the starch that they used to put the layers of paper together, the running of the machinery, the die cutting, folding of the boxes, printing on the surface of the boxes, palletizing, and shipping. And still you had to try and make a profit. So this was an area where I would go into the customer, and if he could shave my price by 1%, where he was making maybe 5% on his bottom line, if he could knock 1% off of my cost, or my price to him, which was 70% of his cost, he would get 770 times 0.5, which is another 0.05. Well, wait a second. He would get another, he would be able to reduce his cost by 0.7% and be able to add all of that difference into his profit. And he would therefore go from a 4.5% profit up to a 5.2%. That's very significant. And as a result, every time there was a discussion about a new order, there was always a very serious discussion about pricing and how we could get that price down if he gave me the order, and how he would have to go someplace else if he did not get my price down. Again, there's as long as the quality of the supplier's product has little effect on of the supplier's product, rather, had little effect on the buyer's product. Again, the buyer must use his purchasing power. Well, when can, now as opposed to must, when can the buyer use his power? Where the supplier has a fixed cost and low marginal cost, if the supplier has an empty factory, if he's not selling a lot of product, if business is turned down, he wants to make sure his fixed costs are covered. And so he will cut the price, taking a marginal profit in order to maintain capacity utilization and keep the plant running. If the buyer is an intermediary between the supplier and the customer and can influence the customer's buying decisions, for example, where the buyer in the first instance buying from the supplier is a wholesaler, and he sells a retailer the product in the next step in the sales process, he can convince the retailer that this is the best product for you based on what kind of a price he, as buyer, selling to the wholesaler, is able to get from his prime supplier. So the fact that he can influence his next customer in the channel of distribution to buy his the recommendations that he makes gives that buyer, the buyer of the original product, significant power in relationship to the original supplier. Also, the buyer can demand better quality and more service. An example of this was, again, with the box industry, was Walmart. And several years ago, as part of their overall inventory control and material flows, they insisted that their suppliers all add an RFID chip to the box for part of the purchase. That's the reason they would buy from you. One of the reasons they would buy from you. Now, the RFID is a radio frequency identification device, and it allows the buyer of the finished product to monitor the flow of the product all the way through his system to the ultimate consumer and into his pantry. And in this case, Walmart was a very large buyer, and they told their suppliers, we want to have this as a condition of purchase on all of the boxes we buy from you. But incidentally, we're not going to pay for it. So this is the case where the buyer was able to force the suppliers to eat the extra costs as a condition for doing business. Now, those are the first two forces. There are two other forces that could only be understood as they occur, and those are the power of new entrants and the power of substitutes. Now, anytime a new entrant enters the marketplace, this means new capacity in the marketplace and a desire on that new entrant to buy market share. And how does he do that? By taking prices down. So when there's a threat of new entrants, it really, as it says on the bottom line there, the new entrant puts a ceiling on the industry profits as a whole and dictates the price rather than having the customer dictate the price. So if you have special situations where the new entrant or the person choosing to come in comes in from a totally different industry, and when they do that, they're going to bring dollars and resources to bear on the industry. They're going to make sure that they're able to get a beachhead in the marketplace. So as a general condition, if the threat of new entrants is high, industry prices will be low. And what you're doing is reducing prices to discourage the new entrant from coming in. So it's done preemptively before anyone's announced their intent to come into your marketplace. It requires an analysis of the market and knowing who are potential people to come in and enter the industry, and making sure that you send signals that say it's going to be a tough process for you to enter my industry. Now, there are high barriers to entry in some cases. Sometimes there are supply side economies of scale. And that may be where if you're going to have a factory, the costs are extremely high to have even a modest sized factory. And so you're forcing the new entrant to spend a lot of money just to understand whether they can be successful in the new industry they want to enter. In some cases, for example, if you were opening up a restaurant, a new restaurant chain, or if you're moving into a new territory where your chain had no real marketplace, you might have to plan to open not just a single store, but maybe as many as 5 or 10 stores in order to support the commissary that you probably would be using to supply the food items to the individual retail stores. So it ups the ante for somebody entering the marketplace where there are economies of scale. The alternative, of course, is that the entrant can accept higher product costs with a smaller plant, and then as a cost just of entering the business. And when that happens, of course, the new entrant is going to suffer some losses as they get themselves established, but they'll probably keep doing that as long as it takes to get that foothold. Sometimes there's demand side benefits of scale, where what the customer wants will help to support the existing supplier because of name recognition or reputation and he's more likely to remain with his existing supplier and look more skeptically at a new supplier. But always you're going to find that new suppliers buy their way in with a lower price. Another kind of barrier to entry is a thing called switching costs. And this, what switching costs are the cost of moving from one product to another. You may have to, sometimes you may have to alter your product specification in order to use a new, cheaper component for your product. And this may also involve a lot of retraining costs. A number of years ago, the Cal State University system switched from a Novell platform to the Windows platform. And this meant some 450,000 computers had to be changed over. That's a significant cost. You also had to provide the training through 23 different IT departments in the different schools in the system. And so it was a significant decision to move from Novell into Windows. Sometimes it actually requires changing ancillary equipment to use the new supplier's product. So it's a sale not only of the component that you're going to use, but also the equipment that inserts a chip, for example, into a different configuration on the motherboard that the chip goes into. So therefore, there are some other costs over and above the savings that might occur for buying the component. Another high barrier is capital cost, and it's hard to finance R&D expenses. So if you've got to go into substantial research and development to make your investment in the new marketplace, you look at that quite hard before you spend money that you may never recover and can't really finance through the banks. However, if you have high industry returns in a particular marketplace, this will increase the appetite of the suppliers to take the flyer anyhow to see how well they can do with the market. There are incumbent advantages. This is continuing the idea of high barriers to entry. There are incumbency advantages where you have proprietary technology, and that will help you either keep suppliers or new entrants at bay, or give them an advantage to try and come into your area. Better sites. If you're again going to open a new food store, where do you find a good location for the traffic that you're going to need? All the good sites are already taken by McDonald's and Taco Bell and Five Guys and all the other major players in that area, so that you're going to have to take a secondary site or keep moving farther and farther from the city as new suburbs begin to develop. Finally, there is a thing called the experience curve, and without trying to prove it, I'll state what it is. There is a belief that in an industry, when the industry volume doubles, costs of delivering product go down by 20%. After that 20% reduction, the next time that the industry sales volume doubles, the industry costs will again go down 20% from that new base. And so it will continue. Just to give a dramatic example, when computers were first introduced for business applications back in the late 50s and 1960s, a good computer would cost you a couple $1 million of $1960, and it would have very limited capability, and therefore only a few buyers could buy it. But because of improvements in the product and increasing number of people capable of using it, you had the phenomenon of democratizing the product. And between 1960 and the mid 1970s, a mini computer came along that was capable of doing what that $2 million computer would do for about 200,000. Within another 10 years, the what we know as our personal computer had become available, and the price had dropped another quantum down to about $2,000. And today, of course, we have our smartphones, which have more power than 1960 technology had. And it could be bought as a smartphone for somewhere between $200 and $300 at the low end of the price spectrum. The result was works in two ways. It's a democratization of the use of the product, that more people can use it. Today, probably 6 billion people have access to some kind of a smartphone, whereas in 1960, the number of people would probably be less than 200 who are capable of using that more expensive product. So this is a huge advantage for the incumbent who's already got the experience curve. And when a new person enters, they've got to do a certain amount of investment just to get to where the incumbent currently is on his experience curve. You may not understand it at this point, but getting access to distribution is very difficult. And you've got to find out how you can get on the customer's radar. You may not be able to afford to have a field sales force, for example. And so what many companies with new products do, will get a rep firm to take and deliver their product. Now, the rep firm probably has a half a dozen products in the same marketplace, but distinctly different from your product. While he could not afford to rep just your product alone, there's not enough margin in there for him to do so. By virtue of having half a dozen products, each of which has a similar kind of gross margin or commission for him, he's able to make a good living. But some of the big companies, like specifically Walmart and people like Target, say they won't deal with reps. They only want to deal with the prime manufacturer. And so this has really destroyed a lot of the rep firms that could be in there in the marketplace. And so it's very difficult to get access for distribution for a new product. And that becomes a real high barrier to entry and something that you need to consider very carefully. Now, we can have also government policy, and this can hurt or help, particularly small firms. Just within the last couple of weeks, California has implemented a law that would require individual truckers, people who have their own business with a single truck, that have many of them have built their way up from having driven trucks for a long time. They've gotten the money to afford to get their own rig. And now California says that all of those people have to be employed by a company. And so this absolutely destroys the position of that individual truck owner. And that's a case where the government, I think in government overreach, they've hurt small business. Of the four forces that we've been considered, the most dangerous one clearly is substitute, because this is something that can blindside you. Substitutes may not increase total market size. What happens is the substitute cannibalizes the existing market. I go back to the tin can example I gave. 25 years ago, the tin can industry was very significant, and I mentioned the introduction of plastic containers as a substitute. And there was one very big tin can manufacturer that made significant purchases in the plastic field on the assumption that they could gain a larger market share with that. But what they were anticipating was that they would be able to increase the market size by having not only their tin can capability, but also their plastic bottle capability. But it turned out that what was happening is customers were not buying more things in packages. They were buying the same number of packages, but they were just choosing to go with either a tin can or aluminum can and a plastic can. So there were more entrants that came into the market, but the substitute just resulted in cannibalizing the market. There was no net new demand. Now, substitutes also limit the profit for the industry, because usually when you've got a substitute, it makes a good price, has a pretty good price benefit for the buyer. And so the substitute ends up setting the price ceiling for the existing product, as well as the price ceiling for, or the prices for the substitute product. And that makes it really difficult. It really puts a damper on profitability for the whole industry. And you could have it just like it says here, you can destroy the profit potential for an entire existing industry. Now, threats of substitutes are high if there are changes going on in new industries that make them viable substitutes for your product, although they were not before. So the little figure there says, keep your eagle eye out, looking for changes in other industries and how they may affect you. I think I've mentioned before the introduction of iTunes and of the iPod into the music industry. Apple was never in the music industry before. The music industry had all of the retail stores, they had the record labels, they had the contracts with the groups, and they had the distribution for the system, or creation of product, and also for the distribution of the product. And in one fell swoop, Apple destroyed that whole marketplace and ended up becoming a dominant player, even though they had not been in that industry at all before. And what they were offering was a good, attractive price performance. In this case, allowing you to buy a single cut on an album instead of buying the whole album. And in this case, the buyer's cost of switching is probably low. They had to have a new device. They had to buy an iPod, but from there, that cost could quickly be recovered by the cheapness of the software that they use with the iPod versus the cost of a CD. So with substitutes, of course, you need to consider brand loyalty, and that's both ways. People went after an Apple product because they knew Apple was good. But there are also people that like to deal with Licorice Pizza, or let's see, another one was Camelot. There were several big companies that had retail stores delivering their CDs, but the brand loyalty toward Apple allowed them to buy over a goodly number of those people. You depend on customer relationships. How do you help the customer in some way besides price on the product? And as you do that, you can build a loyalty that a new substitute may not be able to break. Excuse me. Now, the substitute can't come completely from left field, and that was the case with the iPod and iTunes and its effect on the music industry. Well, the last of the five forces is competitive rivalry within the industry, and there's Smokin' Joe Frazier and the great Muhammad Ali. And intensity of rivalry between firms in the same industry is greatest where there's a lot of competitors going after the same thing, where competitors are roughly the same size but need an industry leader to enforce price discipline. And this becomes a price umbrella. for everybody. And a good example of that was a few years ago. I was doing some work with UPS and talking with the man with whom we worked. He said, you know, we needed to get a kick up in price because our margins were getting crushed. But he said we were afraid to do it because we knew that we couldn't do it if a FedEx didn't go along with it. And American laws prevent you from talking with your competitors about price. And so you kind of have to send a signal and see what will happen. Now, you see this a lot in the airline industry where somebody will come out with a $25 increase in the price from Los Angeles to New York on a flight. And they stick their nose out there and they get bloodied because nobody follows them. Other times, the circumstances may get to be where you have that $25 flight increase and everybody follows you because they can't make money unless they get an additional revenue. So you want to look for somebody to be the price leader and industry leader. And in this case, UPS did put out their price memo, and FedEx followed within a day or two. So here it was, we weren't talking about price with a competitor, but we were sending signals that would allow us to really to protect the industry. In some cases, the industry barriers to exit are high. And this could be because you got highly specialized assets. For example, a bunch of manufacturing equipment that had a high value and you got a big loan on it. And now you find you can't make any money and nobody wants to pay you anything more than the weight of the manufacturing items. They don't want to give you anything in terms of value because they know you're hurting. And so you can't get out of the thing. And so what you find is in certain industries where that happens, people will continue with a marginal arrangement, operating a factory at near zero cash flow, just because the cash flow is greater than $1, because they can't afford to take the big hit and have the bank call their loan. So they continue paying off their loan as they go along. But it brings down the whole industry in terms of profitability. Now, rivals sometimes are highly committed to the business, and maybe they have an aspiration to become the industry leader. Now, Michael Porter said that market share is not the be all and end all, that it's more important to have profits than it is to have market share. But some people will cut their prices in order to try and get that industry leadership. The rivalry here becomes more intense if switching costs are low. People can go from one 7-Eleven to the Arco station, get the same soft drink and a nickel less. Or less for the hot dog that they sell on the all-day fryer that they have in both of those stores. So it costs nothing for the customer to switch from one place to another. There's no loss in his position with that particular supplier the next time he wants to get a hot dog. It's the same as when he buys his gas. If he can get a nickel or a dime saving, he's going to do it, knowing full well that he can go back to his regular dealer as soon as that dealer matches the price of the person that you went to and saved a dime a gallon. If industry growth is slow, it means people just kind of keep whacking away at one another in hopes that the weakest guy will quit the industry and everyone else will survive and grow as a result. It's a tough way to go. And it seems like every time you get the stake through the heart of one of your competitors where they go out of business, somebody else will step up in front of you and keep going with a low price solution that is never profitable. Finally, intensity is higher if firms can't read each other's signal, and that was the case with UPS and FedEx. And in most industries, there's really no leader to demonstrate that market leadership for everyone else. Now, price competition is most likely where products and services are identical. That makes sense. We always do a little bit of shopping and bargaining when we want to buy something. It's more than a nickel or a dime. Where fixed costs are high and marginal costs are low. And this is what we highlighted in the buyer power section of this slide presentation. If you've got a situation where industry capacity has to be expanded in large increments. Several years ago, I knew it cost $1 billion to open a new chip plant, and I think that's probably highly obsolete by this time. And you don't make those kind of decisions on the back of a dinner napkin. You have to think about it for quite a long time. So, in fact, I remember we had a study that we did of the charcoal industry, and the industry leader had a significant market share, and we're thinking about, do we go ahead and expand to build a new kiln? And that's how they make the product, is put the wood in the kiln and char it to a certain extent, and then they end up with a briquette. Through further conversion, they end up with a briquette that's put in a bag and sold to you for your home barbecue. But the amount of time it would take to build one of those kilns was 7 years. And you got to think really long and hard to make a major expenditure, looking at a time horizon that probably exceeds your, as CEO, your time remaining in the company before retirement. So where it has to be expanded in large increments, people are very, very careful before doing it. Finally, you have price competition when the product is perishable. Fresh fish, fresh flowers, the airline seat that took off last night with nobody in it, the hotel room that didn't have a guest last night. These are all perishable inventories. So when you get into competition where there are other where the deciding criteria is something other than price, you're less likely to see the product profitability erode in that case, because it's possible for things other than price to be used to improve customer value. And that allows for, rather than competition driving down prices, it allows for improving the quality or the desirability of the product, and allows even for price increases. This is where you're putting extra value in the mind of the customer. And that is a singular way to make progress in industry. So now we're going to go on and take a look at the value chain.